The morning after the network passed its first true test, Pine Ridge looked almost unnaturally ordinary. The diner opened at the same hour it always did. The bakery windows glowed before sunrise. A delivery truck paused too long at the corner before turning toward Main Street. The courthouse bell marked the hour with the same patient rhythm it had kept for decades. Nothing in the town suggested that, less than a day earlier, a global pattern of pressure had aligned across shipping routes, rail systems, energy grids, weather corridors, and freight networks. Nothing suggested that the silent network had widened the margin before the world systems hardened into cascade. But inside the Pine Ridge archive, ordinary had changed shape. Eleanor Hayes unlocked the door and stepped into the familiar scent of paper, wood, dust, and old bindings. For 22 years, that smell had meant stewardship. Preservation. Continuity. Now it meant something else too. Responsibility. Not because the archive had become less historical. Because history had begun moving through it in real time. She turned on the lights one by one. The wall map came alive slowly. Pins stretching across oceans and continents. Rotterdam. Osaka. Hudson Bay. Buenos Aires. Kansas City. The Pacific corridors. The North Atlantic. The spiral no longer looked like a mystery to her. It looked like a language the world had finally begun to read. Michael Carter arrived 10 minutes later carrying a folder of overnight reports from the silent network and a paper cup of coffee that had already gone half cold. He set both on the table and looked immediately toward the map. "Nothing major overnight," he said. Eleanor nodded. "But not nothing." Michael smiled faintly. "You are starting to sound like a pilot. That should worry me." "It should reassure you," he said. Then he opened the folder. The reports were different from the ones that had filled the archive only days earlier. Less urgent. Less compressed. Still full of small recognitions. A shipping corridor in Rotterdam widened departure spacing before pressure stacked. A regional rail node in Osaka adjusted sequence timing before a dispatch conflict formed. An energy analyst in Buenos Aires rebalanced a load curve 15 minutes earlier than the automated system would have. None of the actions were dramatic. That, Eleanor thought, might be the clearest sign that the lesson had landed. The network was no longer waiting for the spiral to tighten visibly before acting. It was learning the shape of pressure earlier. Michael slid one page across the table. "Look at the timestamps." Eleanor studied them. The recognition moments were no longer clustering into a single inward curve the way they had during the test. Nor were they scattered randomly. Instead, they seemed to arc outward in a widening rhythm. A correction here. Then a quiet anticipation elsewhere. Then another widening adjustment across a different system. She frowned slightly. "It is not the old spiral." Michael nodded. "No." She looked again. The pattern no longer behaved like pressure chasing recognition or recognition outrunning pressure. It looked more distributed than that. Less like a curve trying to close. More like a structure learning how to hold. The archive computer chimed. A message had arrived from Sofia Alvarez in Buenos Aires. Subject line, possible post-spiral morphology. Michael raised an eyebrow. "That sounds encouragingly strange." Eleanor opened the file. Sophia's message contained several visual reconstructions from the network's live reports since the test. The first showed the classic inward spiral as it had appeared historically. The second showed the diverging structure that formed when the network widened margin early. But the third image was new. Neither Michael nor Eleanor spoke at first. The geometry did not look like a spiral. Not exactly. It resembled multiple open arcs radiating outward from a shared center of timing, then bending toward one another again without collapsing. Sophia's note appeared beneath the image. "I do not believe the pattern is disappearing. I believe it is becoming structural rather than reactive." Michael read the line twice. Then a third time. Eleanor looked toward the map on the wall. For 2 centuries the spiral marked where attention arrived too late. Michael nodded. And then it marked where attention arrived in time. Eleanor returned her eyes to Sophia's image. What if this is what comes after that? Michael leaned over the desk. You mean after the lesson is learned? The archive phone rang before she could answer. Michael picked it up. Pine Ridge Archive. Lena Vermeer's voice came through, calm but carrying a note of curiosity that immediately made Eleanor move closer. I think Sophia may be right, Lena said. What are you seeing? Michael asked. Shipping routes are adjusting before pressure gradients fully develop, Lena replied. Not because of warnings. Because the local teams are beginning to recognize corridor behavior earlier on their own. Michael glanced at Eleanor. Not on their own, exactly. Through the network. Through shared memory. Through accumulated attention. Lena continued. It is as if the systems are still producing pressure, but the people inside them are no longer waiting to be surprised by it. Eleanor felt a quiet shift inside that sentence. The systems had not become safer by nature. The people inside them had become more literate. That, she thought, might be the deepest change of all. After the call ended, she wrote a single phrase on the board beneath the newest network map. Pattern literacy. Michael looked at it and nodded slowly. That may be the shape of what comes next. Not a world without pressure. Not a world without storms, delays, load shifts, timing drift, or structural strain. A world where enough people had learned to see pressure early enough that systems no longer needed to reach the edge of failure before they changed direction. The thought was hopeful. But it was not simple. Hope never is, Eleanor thought. A more literate world would also be a more responsible one. If people learned to notice pressure earlier, then ignoring it would become harder to excuse. The archive door remained closed. The stranger had not appeared that morning. For the first time, his absence felt less like mystery and more like a deliberate silence. The center of recognition had widened. Perhaps it no longer needed a single quiet figure standing at the threshold of awareness. Michael seemed to sense the same thing. He is not coming today, he said. Eleanor looked toward the empty doorway. No. Michael rested one hand on Harold Bennett's compass. Do you think that means he is gone? Eleanor considered the question carefully. The answer that came to her was not emotional. It was structural. No, she said at last. I think it means the pattern no longer needs to arrive through him first. The archive fell quiet again. Outside, wind moved gently through the maple trees near the courthouse. Across the world, the silent network was still listening. Still sharing. Still widening margin. And for the first time since the spiral first appeared in old journals and weather margins, the future did not look like a single line of pressure moving toward a point of crisis. It looked like something else. A distributed shape. An unfinished form. Not a warning. A possibility. And somewhere inside that possibility, the season's final question had already begun to form. If the world had learned how to see together in time, what would it choose to become next? The first message that unsettled Eleanor Hayes did not look unusual at all. It arrived mid-morning, quietly joining the steady stream of recognition reports flowing through the silent network. Regional freight corridor. Minor timing adjustment. Margin widened before compression formed. It looked exactly like the kind of report the network had begun seeing more frequently since the spiral test. Small recognition. Small decision. Pressure softened before systems hardened. But the second message felt different. Not because of the data. Because of the wording. Michael Carter noticed it first. He slid the printed report across the table. Read the last line. Eleanor scanned the page. The observer had described a familiar pattern. Early recognition. Corridor adjustment. System stabilized. But beneath the technical notes, a single sentence had been added in the margin. We could have waited. Eleanor looked up. What does that mean? Michael shrugged slightly. It means they chose not to. The phrase lingered in the room. For centuries observers had recognized pressure too late. Now recognition arrived early enough to change outcomes. But early recognition carried something the old spiral records rarely confronted. Choice. The archive computer chimed again. Another message. This one from a weather monitoring station in the Western Plains. The meteorologist had identified a shifting pressure front hours before the automated models updated. The note ended with a different sentence. We warned the corridor early, but they decided not to adjust yet. Eleanor leaned back slowly. That is new. Michael nodded. For the first time the network is seeing recognition, ignored. The word felt heavy. Ignored. For centuries the spiral had exposed when recognition arrived too late. Now the network was beginning to see something more complicated. Recognition arriving early, but not always acted upon. The phone rang. Michael answered. Pine Ridge Archive. Sofia Alvarez's voice came through the speaker. I believe you are starting to see the other side of the pattern. Eleanor leaned toward the desk. What do you mean? Sofia spoke carefully. For 2 centuries the spiral exposed systems that could not see pressure soon enough. Michael nodded. Yes. But early recognition does not guarantee early action. The sentence settled heavily in the room. The silent network had solved one problem. Awareness. But another remained. Decision. Kenji Tanaka joined the call from Osaka. In rail systems we see this frequently. Michael raised an eyebrow. How so? Kenji answered calmly. Dispatchers may recognize a developing conflict early. But adjusting schedules affects multiple stakeholders. Eleanor understood. Delays. Costs. Commitments. Changing a system early often required explaining the change to people who did not yet see the pressure. Kenji continued. So recognition alone does not guarantee cooperation. Michael leaned back slightly. Meaning the spiral may have been hiding a deeper problem. Eleanor finished the thought. The cost of seeing early. Silence followed. For centuries observers acted when systems were already under visible strain. At that point decisions were easier. The pressure was obvious. The risk was undeniable. But early recognition created a new dilemma. Act too early, and others might believe the adjustment unnecessary. Act too late, and the margin disappears. Michael spoke slowly. The spiral taught us how to see. Eleanor nodded. But it did not teach us how to convince. Another message arrived. European Energy Corridor. Load fluctuation detected early. Adjustment recommended. But the final line read, operators decided to wait for additional confirmation. Michael sighed quietly. That confirmation may arrive too late. Sofia responded. Exactly. Eleanor stood and walked toward the spiral map again. The old pattern had always appeared as a curve tightening toward crisis. But the new reports revealed something the historical records had never shown clearly. Between recognition and action existed a fragile space. The space where people decided whether they trusted what they saw. Michael joined her at the map. The spiral was never just about systems. No. It was about people. Kenji spoke again through the speaker. And people do not always agree. Another message arrived. Kansas City. Melissa Grant. Michael answered immediately. What are you seeing? Melissa's voice sounded thoughtful rather than urgent. A familiar pressure drift. Michael glanced at the timestamps. Recognition had arrived early again. What did you do? Melissa paused briefly. We adjusted. Eleanor smiled faintly. You did not wait. Melissa laughed softly. Not after last week. The room relaxed slightly. Michael asked, did anyone question the adjustment? Melissa answered honestly. Of course. Eleanor understood. Every system contained its own logic. Its own priorities. Its own definitions of risk. The silent network could share recognition. But each observer still operated within real institutions, real responsibilities, real consequences. Melissa added quietly, but they listened. Michael asked, why? Another short pause. Because we explained the pattern. Eleanor looked at the board where she had written pattern literacy earlier that morning. Recognition was not enough. People had to understand why recognition mattered. Michael spoke slowly. The network does not only spread awareness. Eleanor nodded. It spreads understanding. Kenji said softly, and understanding builds trust. Sophia added, trust shortens the distance between recognition and action. The idea moved through the archive like a quiet current. The spiral had always revealed pressure. But the network revealed something deeper. Whether people were willing to act on what they saw. Eleanor wrote another phrase beneath the first on the board. Shared judgment. Michael read it aloud. Recognition plus trust. Eleanor nodded. For the first time in history, observers are not alone when they decide. Another message arrived. Weather corridor across the Atlantic. Early pressure shift. Shipping lanes adjusted before the storm strengthened. Michael looked toward the board again. Recognition. Understanding. Trust. The spiral had been teaching the world how to see. Now the network was teaching the world how to act together. He turned toward Eleanor. This is the real shape of what comes next. Eleanor looked back at the map. For centuries the spiral had revealed the cost of not seeing. Now the network was revealing the cost of seeing clearly. Responsibility. Because once someone recognized pressure early enough, they could no longer claim ignorance. The archive door remained quiet. The stranger had not returned. But Eleanor understood something now that she had not fully grasped before. The spiral had never been meant to remove uncertainty from the world. It had been meant to reveal where responsibility began. Outside the courthouse square, the afternoon sun climbed higher. Across the world, the silent network continued sharing recognition signals. Not just warnings. Conversations. Decisions. Trust. And for the first time since the spiral appeared in old journals and weather margins centuries earlier, the future looked less like a mystery waiting to be discovered. It looked like a responsibility waiting to be accepted. The message arrived just after noon. At first it looked like any other recognition signal. A logistics monitoring station in Eastern Europe had detected a gradual compression forming across several freight corridors. Nothing unusual. Nothing urgent. The kind of early pressure drift the silent network had begun identifying more frequently since the spiral. Test. Michael Carter read the report once. Then again. Then he leaned forward and circled 3 lines with his pencil. Eleanor Hayes noticed immediately. What is it? Michael slid the page across the desk. Look at the systems involved. Eleanor read the list carefully. Rail freight timing. River shipping lanes. Energy load balancing. 3 infrastructures interacting across the same corridor. That alone was not unusual. But the final line of the report made her pause. Pressure likely to produce a cascade within 12 hours if unadjusted. Eleanor looked up. 12 hours? Michael nodded. Which means we are seeing it early. For centuries the spiral had exposed pressure minutes before collapse. Now the network was detecting alignment half a day in advance. Recognition had never arrived this early before. The archive computer chimed. Another message arrived from the same region. This one carried a different tone. The observer confirmed the pressure pattern. But the final note read, "Local authorities prefer to monitor the situation before making adjustments." Eleanor frowned. "They want to wait." Michael nodded. "And the window is 12 hours. The room fell quiet. Kenji Tanaka's voice came through the speaker. "I am reviewing the system models now." Sofia Alvarez joined the call a moment later. "We see the same alignment in energy demand projections." Eleanor spoke carefully. "So the pattern is real?" Sofia answered immediately. "Yes." Kenji added, "If no adjustments occur, the corridor will compress." Michael looked at the board. "And if it compresses?" Kenji replied calmly. "The cascade will propagate through rail timing and energy load balancing." Eleanor asked quietly, "How severe?" Sofia hesitated. "Not catastrophic." Michael nodded. "But disruptive." Sofia continued. "Several cities could experience supply interruptions." The sentence carried weight. "Not disaster. But consequences." Michael leaned back in his chair. "So we have 12 hours. Kenji corrected him. "Less." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because convincing people to act early takes time." Eleanor felt the truth of that immediately. Early recognition required trust. And trust did not always move quickly. Another message arrived. This one from the regional logistics coordinator responsible for part of the corridor. The note was polite. Professional. But clear. Current models do not indicate immediate risk. Adjustments may create unnecessary disruption. Michael read it twice. They do not believe the pattern yet. Eleanor crossed her arms. They see the systems. But not the spiral. Kenji spoke again. This is the first time the network has faced a disagreement about early action. Sofia added, and it will not be the last. The silent network had been built on shared recognition. But recognition did not remove human judgment. Observers could see pressure early. But deciding whether to intervene remained complicated. Michael looked at the map. "We could widen margin ourselves." Eleanor tilted her head. "Across other systems?" Michael nodded. "If surrounding networks adjust early, the pressure might dissipate before reaching the corridor." Kenji considered that. "It is possible." Sofia added, "But it would require coordination across multiple regions." Eleanor understood what that meant. The network would need to act before the affected system agreed to act. Not override them. But reshape the surrounding pressures. Michael spoke slowly. For the first time the network must decide whether to intervene indirectly. Silence followed. Because the decision carried ethical weight. The silent network had always respected local authority. Observers shared recognition. But each system made its own decisions. Intervening indirectly could change the balance. Eleanor asked the question quietly. "What does responsibility look like when recognition arrives this early?" Michael did not answer immediately. He looked again at the spiral board. For centuries the spiral had revealed where recognition came too late. Now the network faced a different dilemma. Recognition had arrived so early that people could disagree about whether action was necessary. Kenji said carefully, "In rail systems we call this the uncertainty window." Eleanor asked, "What does that mean?" Kenji explained. When pressure is visible but not yet urgent, different observers interpret risk differently. Sofia added, "Some prefer caution." Michael finished the thought. Others prefer proof. Another message arrived from the corridor. The same coordinator repeated their position. Monitoring continues. No immediate action recommended. Eleanor sighed softly. They are waiting for confirmation. Michael nodded. But confirmation may arrive too late. The archive fell quiet. Outside the courthouse square, the afternoon sun continued moving across the buildings. Time passed whether decisions were made or not. Michael looked toward Eleanor. What do you think? Eleanor studied the map. Shipping. Rail. Energy. The corridor sat where several systems overlapped. The spiral would likely pass through it eventually. The question was whether the network should try to bend the pressure before the corridor believed it necessary. She spoke slowly. For centuries the spiral exposed the cost of waiting. Michael nodded. And now? Eleanor looked at the board where she had written 2 phrases earlier that morning. Pattern literacy. Shared judgment. The network must decide whether shared judgment means shared responsibility. Kenji spoke softly. Meaning we act. Sophia added, even if they prefer not to. Michael glanced toward the map. Small adjustments across surrounding systems could widen the margin before the cascade formed. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to soften the pressure alignment. But the decision would not be invisible. People would notice. And they might question why adjustments occurred before official confirmation. Eleanor whispered quietly, the world has never faced recognition this early. Michael nodded. And we have never faced responsibility this large. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then Michael stood. He walked to the network console and activated the shared channel. Observers across continents paused. Shipping monitors. Rail dispatchers. Energy analysts. Weather stations. Freight coordinators. Michael spoke calmly. We have a corridor where recognition arrived 12 hours early. Eleanor watched the network indicators light up. Dozens of observers listening. Michael continued. The local systems prefer to wait. Kenji's voice came through. What do you propose? Michael looked toward Eleanor once more. She nodded. Then he answered. We widen margin around them. Sophia responded immediately. A distributed buffer. Kenji added, pressure dissipates before reaching the corridor. Eleanor wrote the words slowly across the board. Responsibility expands with recognition. Michael looked at the map. This is the first time the network acts before the spiral fully forms. Eleanor finished the thought. And the first time the future may change before anyone sees the danger. Outside the archive, afternoon light stretched across the courthouse square. Inside, the silent network prepared to make the most difficult decision of the season. Not because the pressure was greatest. But because the responsibility was. For the first time, the world had seen the future early. Now it had to decide whether it would act on that knowledge. The decision moved through the silent network quietly. No announcements. No dramatic countdown. Just observers across continents pausing for a moment to look again at the pressure signals flowing through their systems. A freight dispatcher in Kansas City studied corridor timing drift. A rail coordinator in Osaka reviewed sequencing intervals. An energy analyst in Buenos Aires examined load curves forming across the grid. A shipping monitor in Rotterdam checked departure spacing along a busy Atlantic route. Each of them saw the same thing. Pressure was gathering. Along a corridor thousands of miles away. But the decision they were about to make would not occur there. It would happen everywhere else. Inside the Pine Ridge archive, Michael Carter stood in front of the spiral board, watching recognition signals arrive from the network. Eleanor Hayes remained beside the long table, writing timestamps beside each observer's adjustment. For centuries the spiral had revealed itself when pressure converged toward a single point. Now the network was about to attempt the opposite. Distributed widening. Small adjustments across multiple systems designed to soften the pressure before it reached the corridor. Kenji Tanaka's voice came through the speaker first. Rail dispatch widening departure spacing across 3 junctions. Michael nodded. Confirmed. Sofia Alvarez followed. Energy grid balancing earlier than scheduled. Eleanor wrote the time down. Another signal appeared. Rotterdam shipping corridor. Departure windows widening by 8 minutes. Then Kansas City freight dispatch. Minor corridor staggering across 2 routes. Michael stepped back from the board. For the first time since the silent network formed, the spiral map was filling with adjustments instead of warnings. Observers were acting before the pattern demanded it. Eleanor looked toward the timestamps. Pressure is slowing. Michael nodded slowly. It has to travel through the systems we just widened. Another message arrived. Weather monitoring station in the North Atlantic. Wind pressure gradient shifting slightly earlier than forecast. Kenji spoke again. The corridor pressure alignment is weakening. Eleanor felt the room exhale slightly. The cascade had not formed yet. The margin had widened. But the decision had not reached its most delicate moment. Because the corridor itself still had not acted. The logistics coordinator responsible for the region had chosen to monitor rather than adjust. Michael studied the map carefully. If the surrounding systems soften enough. Eleanor finished the thought. The corridor may never experience the full pressure. Another signal arrived. Southern Rail Corridor. Sequence timing correction applied early. Kenji spoke calmly. The convergence window is widening. Sophia added, energy demand curve flattening. Michael leaned slightly closer to the board. For the first time that day, the spiral did not look like a tightening curve. It looked like a set of open arcs bending away from each other. The pattern was dissolving before it could fully appear. Eleanor smiled faintly. We are bending the future. Michael shook his head gently. No. He pointed toward the map. We are bending pressure. The difference mattered. The network was not predicting events. It was simply recognizing them early enough to change how they unfolded. The archived computer chimed again. A message from the corridor itself. Michael opened it carefully. The logistics coordinator's note was brief. Pressure drift appears smaller than earlier projections. Monitoring continues. Eleanor laughed softly. They still do not see it. Michael folded the paper. They do not need to. Another signal appeared. Atlantic shipping lane. Departure spacing widened by 12 minutes. Kenji spoke again. The corridor convergence has dropped below cascade threshold. Silence followed. The pressure alignment that once threatened to propagate through multiple infrastructures had softened. Not vanished. Just dispersed. Michael stepped back from the board and lowered the pencil he had been holding. It is done. Eleanor looked toward the map again. The spiral had not appeared. Instead, the adjustments formed something else. A wide open structure of early decision stretching across the network. Kenji said quietly, the spiral never closed. Sophia added, because we acted before it could. Eleanor leaned lightly against the desk. For centuries the spiral revealed the moment when systems reached their limit. Michael nodded. And today the limit moved. Outside the archive windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the courthouse square. People walked past the old brick building without realizing that the future of several infrastructures had just shifted quietly across continents. No alarms had sounded. No crisis had formed. Just a network of observers recognizing pressure early enough to widen the margin together. Michael looked at the spiral board again. The pattern had changed shape. It was no longer a curve that tightened toward collapse. It had become something more stable. A structure that absorbed pressure gradually. Eleanor spoke quietly. This is the shape Sophia showed us. Michael nodded. The shape of what comes next. The archive door opened softly. Neither of them had heard footsteps approach. But when Eleanor turned, the stranger stood in the doorway. Plain coat. Dust on the boots. Calm expression. Exactly as he had appeared across the centuries recorded in the archive. Michael smiled slightly. You always arrive at the end. The stranger stepped into the room slowly. His eyes moved across the spiral board. The timestamps. The network map. Then he spoke. You moved before the pattern. Eleanor nodded. For the first time. The stranger studied the board carefully. For the first time the spiral did not need to form. Michael crossed his arms. Because recognition arrived earlier. The stranger nodded once. For several seconds no one spoke. The archive felt quieter than it had all day. Then Eleanor asked the question she had been wondering since the spiral first accelerated. Was this always the goal? The stranger looked toward the spiral map again. For centuries the spiral showed where recognition arrived too late. Michael finished the thought. And today? The stranger smiled faintly. Today recognition arrived in time. Outside the windows, the sky had begun turning gold. The world beyond Pine Ridge continued moving through its ordinary routines. But inside the archive the pattern that had once belonged to storms and railways and rivers had changed shape. The spiral had taught the world how to see. Now the network was learning how to act. And the future was beginning to take a different form. For a long moment after the corridor pressure dissolved, the Pine Ridge archive was completely silent. Not the tense silence that had filled the room earlier that day. A different kind. The quiet that arrives when something complicated finally makes sense. Michael Carter stood near the spiral board, studying the pattern of timestamps that had formed across the map. They did not resemble the spirals Eleanor Hayes had first drawn weeks earlier. They looked wider. More stable. Less like a curve racing toward collapse. More like a structure that absorbed pressure gradually. Eleanor walked slowly toward the board and placed the pencil down beside the map. For 2 centuries, she said softly, the spiral showed the moment when systems ran out of time. Michael nodded. And today we moved the moment. Eleanor glanced toward the doorway. The stranger was still standing there. Calm. Unhurried. Watching the board the same way witnesses had described in the old archive journals. Not interfering. Not directing. Simply observing the moment when recognition arrived early enough. Michael spoke quietly. It worked. The stranger nodded once. Yes. Eleanor turned toward him. For centuries the spiral revealed where pressure outran awareness. The stranger said nothing. She continued. And today awareness arrived first. Michael leaned slightly closer to the board. The spiral never formed. The stranger stepped forward and studied the map carefully. Then he spoke. The spiral did form. Michael frowned slightly. But we never saw it. The stranger traced the edge of the map lightly with one finger. You saw it early. The distinction mattered. For centuries the spiral had appeared only after pressure aligned visibly across systems. Now recognition had moved earlier in time. The pattern had still existed. But the network had seen it before it tightened. Eleanor understood. The spiral is not disappearing. The stranger nodded. It is moving. Michael crossed his arms. Moving where? The stranger looked toward the network display where observers across the world continued exchanging quiet recognition signals. Into the network. Silence settled across the room. The spiral had once been a phenomenon that traveled through systems. Now the systems themselves were beginning to carry the pattern of recognition. Observers had learned how to see pressure early enough that the spiral no longer needed to announce itself dramatically. Michael looked again at the board. For centuries you stood at the center. The stranger did not answer immediately. Instead he studied the spiral marks Eleanor had drawn earlier that morning. Then he spoke. For centuries recognition traveled slowly. Eleanor nodded. Until the network. The stranger smiled faintly. And now recognition travels everywhere at once. Michael looked toward the map. Shipping observers in Rotterdam. Rail dispatchers in Osaka. Energy analysts in Buenos Aires. Freight coordinators in Kansas City. Weather watchers across the Pacific. Archivists in Pine Ridge. The center had widened. Recognition no longer needed a single quiet observer standing beside the pattern. It had become something shared. Eleanor asked gently, "So what happens to you now?" The stranger looked toward the courthouse windows where the evening sky had begun to deepen into soft blue. For centuries my work was simple. Michael waited. I preserved the moment before recognition. Eleanor felt the meaning settle. And now? The stranger turned toward the network map. Now the moment preserves itself. Michael smiled faintly. The network. The stranger nodded. For the first time since the spiral records began, the pattern no longer required a single witness standing at its center. Recognition had become distributed. Shared. Alive inside the network of observers who had learned how to listen. Eleanor closed the ledger she had begun earlier that morning. On the final page she wrote a single line. The spiral changed shape when the world learned how to see together. Michael picked up Harold Bennett's compass and turned it slowly in his hand. The faint spiral carved into the metal ring caught the last light from the windows. 4 weeks the symbol had represented mystery. Now it represented continuity. The spiral had never been a warning. It had been a teacher. Outside the archive, evening had settled across Pine Ridge. Streetlights flickered on. Cars moved slowly along Main Street. Ordinary life continued. But somewhere beyond the quiet town, observers across the silent network were still watching. Still noticing. Still widening margins where pressure gathered quietly inside the systems that shaped the modern world. The stranger stepped toward the doorway. Michael looked up. You are leaving. The stranger paused. For now. Eleanor asked softly, will we see you again? The stranger considered the question carefully. When recognition needs reminding. Then he looked once more at the spiral board. Not the old tightening curve. The new widening structure. Then he spoke the final sentence that would remain in the archive long after the night had passed. The future is not written by pressure. Michael waited. The stranger continued. It is written by the moment someone notices. He stepped outside into the quiet evening and crossed the courthouse square slowly. Plain coat. Dust on the boots. Just another traveler moving through a small town most people never noticed. But inside the Pine Ridge archive, the pattern he had protected for centuries had found a new home. Not in one observer. Not in one place. In a network of people who had learned how to see. Michael looked toward Eleanor. So this is what comes next. Eleanor nodded. The spiral continues. Michael smiled slightly. But the world is finally keeping up with it. Outside, wind moved gently through the trees along the courthouse lawn. Across continents and oceans, the silent network continued listening. The spiral had not ended. It had simply changed shape. In forgotten places, where wind carries memory, where silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. You have been listening to whispers of reckoning. The spiral was never a prophecy. It was a signal. And once enough people learn to recognize the signal together, the future stops being something that happens to the world. It becomes something the world helps shape. Pressure gathers. Until someone listens. And every act leaves an echo.